I chose to do my first reading from Henry James' Daisy Miller, and it starts on page 32 with the line, "Look here, Mrs. Walker," and it continues on to page 34. "Look here, Mrs. Walker," she went on. "You know I'm coming to your party. I am delighted to hear it. I've got a lovely dress. I'm very sure of that. But I want to ask a favor, permission to bring a friend." "I shall be happy to see any of your friends," said Mrs. Walker, turning with a smile to Mrs. Miller. "Oh, they are not my friends," answered Daisy's mamma, smiling shyly in her own fashion. "I never spoke to them. It is an intimate friend of mine. Mr. Giovanelli," said Daisy, without a tremor in her clear little voice or a shadow on her brilliant little face. Mrs. Walker was silent a moment. She gave a rapid glance at Winterbourne. "I shall be glad to see Mr. Giovanelli," she then said. "He's an Italian," Daisy pursued, with the prettiest serenity. "He's a great friend of mine. He's the handsomest man in the world, except Mr. Winterbourne. He knows plenty of Italians, but he wants to know some Americans. He thinks ever so much of Americans. He's tremendously clever. He's perfectly lovely." It was settled that this brilliant personage should be brought to Mrs. Walker's party. And then Mrs. Miller prepared to take her leave. "I guess we'll go back to the hotel," she said. "You may go back to the hotel, Mother, but I'm going to take a walk," said Daisy. "She's going to walk with Mr. Giovanelli," Randolph proclaimed. "Alone, my dear? At this hour?" Mrs. Walker asked. The afternoon was drawing to a close. It was the hour for the throng of carriages and the contemplated pedestrians. "I don't think it's safe, my dear," said Mrs. Walker. "Neither do I," subjoined Mrs. Miller. "You'll get the fever as sure as you live. Remember what Dr. Davis told you." "Give her some medicine before she goes," said Randolph. The company had risen to its feet. Daisy, still showing her pretty teeth, bent over and kissed her hostess. "Mrs. Walker, you are too perfect," she said. "I'm not going alone. I'm going to meet a friend." "Your friend won't keep you from getting the fever," Mrs. Miller observed. "Is it Mr. Giovanelli?" asked the hostess. Winterbourne was watching the young girl. At this question his attention quickened. She stood there smiling and smoothing her bonnet ribbons. She glanced at Winterbourne. Then, while she glanced and smiled, she answered, without a shade of hesitation, "Mr. Giovanelli, the beautiful Giovanelli." "My dear young friend," said Mrs. Walker, taking her hand pleadingly, "don't walk off to the Pincio at this unhealthy hour to meet a beautiful Italian." "Well, he speaks English," said Mrs. Miller. "Gracious me!" Daisy exclaimed. "I don't want to do anything improper. There's an easy way to settle it," she continued to glance at Winterbourne. "The Pincio is only 100 yards distant, and if Mr. Winterbourne were as polite as he pretends, he would offer to walk with me." Winterbourne's politeness hastened to affirm itself, and the young girl gave him gracious leave to accompany her. All right, so I chose this passage because I don't like Daisy, and I think that that colored my reading of this text a lot, but in this passage, I was just, I feel like it really exemplifies everything I don't like about her, and I don't think we're supposed to like her, because she's so self-centered, and she's pretending like she's following the rules, and she's pretending like she's taking everybody's advice into account, and she's really just doing whatever suits her best without really thinking about the way that anybody else would want her to act, which I guess you could praise her for, but the way that she's doing it is like conniving. I don't know, the way that she's doing it is pretending like she cares and then being like, "Oh, I don't want to do anything improper, but it's fine." And then the way she's also talking to Winterbourne, and she's shoving Mr. Giovanelli in his face, which is just rude because he's obviously interested in her, especially because it's talking about how his attention quickened, and she noticed that, like she knew that he was paying attention, and nonetheless she went on to keep talking about him and how wonderful he is, and he's Italian and he's great and he thinks so much of Americans and he's going to meet her for this late afternoon walk. And then she throws Winterbourne in there every once in a while, and he's the handsomest man in the world except Mr. Winterbourne. So she's keeping him on this little hook, and pretending like she's still in the back of his mind when really she's focused on Mr. Giovanelli. And that's just selfish on her part because she just wants attention from anywhere she can get it. And so she wants Mr. Winterbourne to still be interested in her, but she also wants to go off with this Italian and hang out with him. And not only does she want that, she wants Mr. Winterbourne to accompany her to go meet this other guy. Like, imagine that you're with someone and they're gonna go off on a date and they ask you to take him there to the date. That's just rude, especially if you're interested in them. And it's obvious that he is. And so she's just taking advantage of him and everyone. And so that's one of the reasons that I really don't like Daisy. And I knew that someone was going to die in this text because of what Professor Rigsby said at the very beginning of the semester, that someone's going to die in every single book. And as I was reading it, at first I was like, oh, okay, I don't really know who it's going to be. Like, it'll be interesting to see who it's going to be. And then I got halfway through the book and I got to this part and I was just like, it's got to be Daisy. And if it's not Daisy, I'm going to be frustrated. I hope it's Daisy, which is probably not good. But I was not fond of her. And I feel like this just shows why she's not a good person and the way that she just interacts with people, because she's spoiled and she just wants attention constantly. She craves the attention. And for a child to want attention like that, it like makes sense and it's kind of acceptable because they don't understand the way to properly get attention yet. But she's supposed to be like becoming an adult, like she's supposed to be a young woman, and she's like, by that point you should understand the correct ways to get attention and the ways that are just manipulative and conniving. And I don't know, I think that she's really smart but also really manipulative, and that bugs me about her because she's not using her intelligence to do anything good. She's just using it to get things to be the way she wants them. Well, I mean, granted, I don't think she's being intentionally malicious, but I just don't think she's thinking about anyone else. So she's not thinking like, oh, I'm gonna do this to make Winterbourne upset. She's just doing it because she wants to do it, and she's not thinking about the way that it's going to affect him. So I don't think it's intentionally malicious, but it does end up hurting other people, and she's so focused on herself and what she wants that in and of itself is malicious because she's an adult at this point. She is an adult to the point where she should be able to comprehend that that's not okay, and she needs to stop seeking attention this way. And I mean, her little brother does it too, but her little brother is a child. Like, her little brother is obnoxious, but it's more understandable because even though he's like, oh, America's better, like, I want to go back to America, he's a kid, you know? And Daisy's supposed to be like, Daisy, like, is going around looking after him in some of the parts of the book, and yet she's less mature, the same amount of mature, if not less, than he is. And, she just drives me crazy. But I just think that this section was when I really looked at her and was like, she just is an attention-seeking, loose woman. Let's put it that way. She's not exactly concerned with a moral code or the way that people are going to view her. And she pretends to be because she feels like she's supposed to, but she's just very focused on herself and what she wants, and she's not really thinking about how that's going to affect anyone else around her. So, yes, Daisy Miller.